Congressman McCaul, thank you so much for doing this. It's a timely topic. I know it's a busy time for you, so we appreciate your taking a few minutes to talk to us about both the report, the work you've done on China, and the work you've done on semiconductors, both of which I think are vital for national security. So I thought we'd start by just asking you if you want to give us an overview of what your thinking is on these days, and then we can go into a few questions.
Well, sure, Jim. And let me thank you and CSIS for your great partnership and leadership on all these issues. And I hearken back to our kind of glory days writing the cybersecurity report, and very bipartisan, just an American national security issue that I believe became the most downloaded report on the internet for a while. CSIS is just a great think tank and provides such great services for members of Congress like myself, particularly in the national security space. I chaired Homeland, and now I'm the lead Republican on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I was asked by Leader McCarthy to chair the China Task Force. It was supposed to be bipartisan, and then at the last minute, the speaker opted out. But I do think it's not a Republican Democrat issue. It's an American issue. We treat it very much as a policy exercise, not a partisan. And I think that's borne out by the report's recommendations. 400 of them, 200 legislative, 2/3 of those were bipartisan bills that I think we can accomplish regardless of who wins the election in November, and for the sake of our security. And we looked at all things related to our foreign policy with the Chinese, with the PRC. If I could just say quickly, this is not my first. Well, I'm from Texas, so it's not my first rodeo with China espionage, and we'll probably talk about the Houston consulate in a minute. But in 1996, I was a very young prosecutor in the Department of Justice, and was assigned the Johnny Chung case, which in 1997 led us to the Director of Chinese Intelligence and China Aerospace, keenly focusing on military technologies and satellite technologies and how they could have tech transfers under the Export Control Act, which is under the Foreign Affairs jurisdiction. Really a fascinating case involving, we had to put them under federal protection. We got these wiretaps. It led us to the Director of Chinese Intelligence putting money into his Hong Kong bank account to influence the '96 presidential election. And we think that they are back to their old tricks in this election cycle, as well. But for me, as a young guy, and by the way, my FBI agent was indicted for espionage. He was sleeping with a Chinese spy.
Oh, I remember that one.
Honeypot syndrome. So it's nothing new to me, but we did. Yeah. I think the biggest, Jim, and I'd love to open up for questions. We looked at Belt and Road. How can we be more competitive with China globally, both economically, militarily? We looked at our military posture in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits. We looked at a more aggressive China when it comes to expansion into Hong Kong, into the Himalayas, with respect to Taiwan. We looked at their hypersonic capability, which surpasses us. We looked at it very extensively at all things technology like AI, quantum, cyber, 5G, the race for 5G with Huawei. How can we get our allies working with us? And I think getting the Five Eyes to reject Huawei, particularly Great Britain when they were actually moving from 4 to 5G, I think was a very significant move. Human rights violations, enormous. And then just control of powerful positions at the United Nations. But I do think the biggest takeaway that you and I will be talking about is the supply chain. And I think most Americans did not recognize the threat until they held up our PPE equipment, the protective equipment for medical. They nationalized 3M and GM in the PRC and controlled the exports to the United States and Europe. I would argue price gouged Europe. And so we took a real deep dive on supply chain. Now, I would argue that not everything supply chain needs to be scrutinized. I think that primarily national security related issues, like medical, but also like technology, which is, I know, the focus of our discussion here today. And we looked at, all things technology, but particularly these advanced semiconductor chips that are really the on-off switch, the brains, if you will, for everything that's got an on-off switch, from everything from your phone to fighter jets. And, the PRC has initiated or launched $1 trillion digital campaign, and we have to be competitive with them. We try not to say they're an evil empire. There is malign influence, certainly. But we just have to be competitive with them globally. And we also need to stop the theft of intellectual property, which you and I dealt with on the cyber security report, which has been going on for decades. But it's gotten to an all-time high. I think Keith Alexander said it was the biggest transfer of wealth in human history. That is why the Houston consulate was shut down, because of the theft of biomedical research at the Texas Medical Center, particularly MD Anderson, and also the R&D for the vaccine itself. They would love to steal that to save the world from the virus that came out of their country. And we also had enormous espionage operations coming out of there. NASA, we had a Texas A&M professor indicted for stealing NASA data and selling it to, the mothership, back in China. So it's a real threat that I think the American people, kind of like Pearl Harbor, have woken up. And I call it the sleeping giant waking up to what is a real threat out there. And it's a generational struggle. My father had, he bombed the Nazis. He's part of World War II. And I grew up in the Cold War, as you did as well. Then we had 9/11. We focused a lot on radical Islamist terror. Today, I think the greatest generational struggle and competition is going to be with the Chinese Communist Party. And then lastly, Jim, we got into the origins of COVID-19 and investigated what happened. And it was a bit disturbing, the extent to which they tried to silence the doctors who were aware of this. And remember, the SARS-like virus had to be reported within 24 hours under the new WHO guidelines. And they wholly failed to do that. In fact, they silenced the doctors from reporting this. They also went into the labs and destroyed lab samples to control the case, the investigation. And I think most egregiously would not admit it was human-to-human transmission, which unfortunately Director General Tedros sided with President Xi and did not alert the world to the threat, which is his number one primary mission. Meanwhile, you got the Lunar New Year's festival going on in China. 5 million people leave Wuhan throughout mainland China, travel internationally. That's the point where it went from an epidemic to a global pandemic that has obviously caused a lot of both loss of life and economic destruction, as well. I'll end on this one. We did translate the report into Mandarin through the State Department, and we were able to penetrate the firewall into China. I mean, I think you'd be really interested in this, Jim. And we got the report into mainland China, and it went viral. And so much so that President Xi's spokesman denounced it, and they dedicated an hour-long television appearance on CGTN denouncing or debunking the McCaul report. So needless to say, I kind of watch my back a little more closely these days. But it was
was a great to Beijing for a while.
It was a great education for the people of China, who are really the victims here of a very oppressive government.
So one question that comes up routinely when I talk about this from business groups and from foreign governments is, so no matter how the election goes, US policy will keep on the same direction towards China. This is a bipartisan thing that the US will be doing. Where do you think we're going?
Oh, I think again, I say it's an American issue, and I think it's very bipartisan. And I think the other side, they should have been a part of this. They wanted. I think after this election, I think we go back to being Americans first, and that's why we made it a policy exercise. That's why 2/3 of the recommendations were bipartisan. And on the supply chain issue, it's probably one of the most bipartisan issues in the Congress. I was able to reach out to, when I introduced the Chips for America Act, I immediately reached out to my high-tech co-chair, Doris Matsui from California, because, Silicon Valley. I sit here in Austin with a lot of tech companies like Samsung, Intel, Qualcomm. They have the same dynamic in California. And then New York has Global Foundry. So this is really, and Anna Eshoo is a dear friend. She's very close to Pelosi. I think I was able to navigate the political stream to really make it a very much bipartisan effort in the House. We got it passed onto the National Defense Authorization Bill. And then Senator Cornyn, working with Senator Mark Warner, who is very good at technology, as you know, working it again in a very bipartisan spirit.
Yeah, we had Senators Cornyn and Warner on a couple weeks ago to talk about the bills that were going out and the progress that had been made. I should note that we invited Congresswoman Matsui and just couldn't work out the scheduling, so we will get her at some future date, probably after the election. But it's been an amazing amount of progress, and particularly you keep talking about the supply chain. A few years ago, supply chain issues weren't as prominent. What do you think has made people change their mind on the Hill about this?
Well, I think COVID. I think COVID woke up the American people. I think they didn't realize that we could be held hostage with our medical supply coming out of China. A big takeaway. And then, the education piece I have is on the technology side, why that's so important. I don't know, but for COVID, if we would be talking about legislation quite like this. I think for too long, in my sense, is whether it be the talent pool or the tax regulatory policy and cheap labor, quite frankly, has pushed a lot of our technology offshore because of talent pool issues, because of labor, because of taxation policies. And what we try to do in a bipartisan way is what the Semiconductor Industry Association told us was we need a grant program to have a capital investment from the federal government, which I don't think anything quite like this could be done pre-COVID, but also an innovative tax policy. They particularly like the refundable investment tax credit because their infrastructure costs are so enormous up front as they build these fabrication plants. And so we kind of put their ideas in a bill. I hope in the lame duck, Jim, we can get this thing done.
When Senator Cornyn was talking to me, he said that the appropriators were being a little sticky on this. Do you think that's going to change in the lame duck?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a good story. One appropriator, who happens to be the chairman, and that would be the gentleman from Alabama, Senator Shelby, actually voted yes on this and then turned around when his staff told him to change the vote and he voted no. I do think there are enough supporters of this, whether it be in the House. McCarthy's a big fan of this bill, as is, I think, Speaker Pelosi. Schumer with Global Foundries in New York. And McConnell's been somewhat agnostic, but I think he's supportive. Then you got Senator Pompeo, you got all of his national security team in the administration, O'Brien, Wilbur Ross at Commerce, very, very supportive of this. I think there can be enough pressure to be applied to get to yes on this.
One of the things I've heard from industry is they at least some parts of industry is, do we need to take a big picture look at the semiconductor industry and just not look at fabs, but look at design, all the whole semiconductor ecosystem. What are you hearing from industry?
I think you're absolutely right. I enjoy in Austin here a great ecosystem of a university. We have the basically the Army, Futures Command here, which does all the research and development for the Army, comes out of Austin. So you can imagine the tentacles of the Chinese Communist Party around that. But then we have this great ecosystem of all these tech, both manufacturers of chips, but also consumers like Apple in my district. And, Apple's able to repatriate $1 billion without the tax liability recently and really upstart the company, a lot of new jobs. And so I think as China talks about their $1 trillion digital plan for the future, we can't let this rhetoric go without response. And I think this is our response.
Where do you think the next move is in this? Do you think it's what are the chances that it'll actually get passed in the lame duck? You're optimistic, or?
I am, because we got the authorization in the NDAA. So now we're looking at the fund the government bill, which is that's always a cliffhanger that we have every year. That will pass, and it has to pass. So if we have the authorization in place, the appropriation should fall. But it's important to say that's for the Secretary of Commerce for their $25 billion grant program to invest in this at the federal level. What we really need is the changes in the tax provisions to incentivize the companies to manufacture here in the United States or in an allied nation. There's a program we have with our allied countries on this as well. We just can't afford for these to be produced in either the CCP or a country that's under enormous pressure.
What? I lost my train of thought there for a minute. You want to talk? This is a strange question from CSIS, but do you want to talk a little bit about the tax provisions, because that also seemed to be a sticky point in some of the talking.
Yeah, great. That's a great question. I found this to be, Jim, an extraordinary experience because, as you know, when I chaired Homeland, I had to deal with jurisdiction all the time. We were trying to fix that, but this was really an enormous lift to have 11 full committees with 15 members from all the 11 committees and the staff, who I give a lot of credit to, working overtime to get the product out, get this report done. But, dealing with the jurisdictional circles, the thing I found very interesting with Ways and Means, which is the tax committee, was, they normally, their perspective is they look at, tax policy through more of an economy lens and not a national security lens. And we had some really powerful discussions. And I said, look, guys, you can't view this as just an economic issue anymore. You have to look at it through the lens of national security. And we really, it really opened their eyes to you're right. We have to take this more seriously. And so while there is a resistance to the refundable investment tax credit, I think Ways and Means wanted to wind that down. There is a lot of support for the R&D tax credit, by the way. I think that's going to be an easier lift. I think the more difficult lift is to get to, I defer to them on taxes on more national security, but this is the intersection of national security and tax policy now. And I think they do look at it differently, different perspective. And I hope we can, because the industry is really crying out for this refundable investment tax credit, I hope that's what we can achieve.
So one of the questions would be, how much do you need to sell this to the American people, and how would you do that? I mean, 5 years ago, China was going to be we were wrong. So how do you tell people the world changed?
I think the American people are there. I mean, I think the only, I always try to look at a silver lining. The only thing that's good that's come out of this whole pandemic is taking another look at the way our relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. I think the American people are there, and that's why this is such a bipartisan issue. So I think who I need to convince more would be some of the old entrenched guard on, particularly, not to get in trouble here, particularly with the Ways and Means Committee, to take a different look at this from a tax policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe we'll steer clear from that one so we don't jinx anything. But, so one of the words that used to be radioactive on the Hill was industrial policy. And, that seems to be another one you can say without being thrown out of the room. What changed on that? Was it COVID again or what?
I find that, and I get, the Wall Street Journal interviewed me on this, and, I'm a free market, guy. And I don't think this policy could have been possible without COVID. I think we're looking at this as a whole government approach. That, in China, everything's state subsidized. It's very difficult to compete with them, whether it be Huawei or other things, Belt and Road, when everything's state subsidized. So, I don't think we'd be having this conversation pre-COVID. I do think that we have grant programs in other areas. Why not in this? And at a pretty large scale, because if we fail to do so, then we're failing to compete with China on a very important issue. And I think people understand that. And, I had a good discussion with Larry Kudlow in the White House, and he's very much in favor of changing the tax policy, a little less sanguine about this industrial policy. I had to get to a point in my own thinking about it that we can't afford not to do it right now, or we could lose this competition, that we find ourselves in. And so I think most, on both sides will support, as they did on the National Defense Authorization Bill. They did support this. And I think the appropriations will, Kay Granger, who's the top Republican on appropriations, and the chairwoman are both very supportive of this policy. So I think we're going to get there.
We're talking a lot about the Hill, so maybe we'll stick with that for a while. But what do you think the next steps are when it comes to legislation to support the semiconductor industry? Will you expand beyond fabs? I mean, what the R&D credit is really useful, but what more could be done?
Well, I think R&D tax credits can be important, not only for technology, but medical. We have to manufacture more of this medical supply in the United States. That's what got the American people's attention in the first place. Shifting to technology, making the case that it's so important to our national, security. So we made a lot of recommendations in this report. In the short term, my goal is lame duck to get the authorization. I'll be a conferee on the National Defense Authorization Committee. Make sure that authorization with the Senate gets enacted and then appropriated. And then I think the tricky part, Jim's going to be working with what we call the four corners, which would be, the appropriators, chairman, ranking House, Senate, and then Ways and Means House, Senate, to get them to all sign off on this tax policy innovative incentive, if you will, to be put into the appropriations package.
Your office and you have been doing a lot of work on export controls. And that was, of course, one of the areas identified as a potential weakness in FIRMA. Want to tell us a little bit about what you're thinking on export controls are now revision?
Well, I'm glad I told you that when I was, about 30 years old, working on that case, it was a real eye-opener how they were trying to manipulate the Export Control Act to their military advantage by, saying things were actually the dual-use technology stuff, right? By saying that military technology was actually dual use, and then trying to influence policymakers so they could obtain more of it. And, over the past couple of decades, they have. You look at blueprints of aircraft, it looks very similar to ours. And they have more ships now in the Navy than we do. And so I think we need to take another look at export control. I don't want to, I'm very mindful of the private sector and our, our defense contractors and what they can do. But I do think we got to be careful because you don't want to arm what is, I think, the longest term threat to our national security. And they've been doing this for decades now, and they're getting pretty good at it.
Yeah. What would you say the right limits are for exports to China? One of the big debates was over what chips could go, what kind of manufacturing equipment could go. Have you looked at that at all?
Yeah, and I think that's something that, we make a recommendation to, try to take a second look at it. And yeah, I mean, if supply chain, again, if our technology can be exported to China and turned against us, we have to be really cognizant of that fact and view it in a different way. Again, we don't want to. I mean, they're very, very systematic and very deceptive at their ability to steal things. They're very good at it, and then they use our own system against us, whether it be the Export Control Act and technology, or our open academic environment. I mean, I think they have turned that on its head. We have a freedom of speech, and they use that against us and their propaganda. We have a freedom of thought at universities, and that's the hallmark of our university system. But they're able, through the 1,000 Talents program and Confucius Institute, able to turn that on its head against us. And that was another part in the report. We got to take a look at this. And I go back to MD Anderson and the Texas Medical Center, where you have these researchers who have been tapped into in the 1,000 Talents program, and they were stealing a lot of information. I will say, you saw the open trash cans burning on the rooftop of the consulate. That's about all they had to destroy those documents, and we really got a treasure trove, without getting into details, a treasure trove of information out of that consulate, which I think will be very helpful. And it's good to see a Department of Justice taking it seriously, whereas before we just turned a blind eye to it.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch the reaction in China, because the Chinese, it's kind of ironic, to your point, that the Chinese can use Facebook as long as it's anti-American sentiments. They can't use it for anything else. So they even have instructions on how to circumvent the Great Firewall, so you can post anti-American stuff on our social media, which
our
like
United States military created the vaccine, or created the virus.
That's okay. Put on your foreign affairs hat for a minute and tell us about what you're doing with allies when it comes to supply chain.
I think this is one of the most important pieces to the report. And yeah, I've really enjoyed this new leadership position. I think when I chaired Homeland, the threat was, cyber, it still is, but it was, ISIS and the Caliphate. And now it's really foreign nation adversary states. And that's what I've been looking at on the Foreign Affairs Committee is, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And so it's a really great position, because you're talking to ambassadors all the time. You're getting their thinking, particularly our NATO ally partners and Five Eye partners. How do they view this? And I do think there is a growing appetite with the allies against this Belt and Road Initiative that we're seeing taking place. We haven't been competitive, and you've seen them in the African continent going into developing nations with this debt trap diplomacy, where they bring their own workers in, exploit their economies local, and then they end up in debt, and they plant their Huawei down, which is a telecom surveillance apparatus. We saw ports like Sri Lanka and Djibouti going to the Chinese Communist Party. In fact, the Panama Canal that Teddy Roosevelt built and Carter gave it back, and now you got both ends of the canal. You got China controlled the ports there. So there's been an awakening within our allied nations, I think, to this threat. As well. We can't do it alone. The United States, we're a great country, but we really need to work with our allied partners on this.
Yeah, we got a few questions from the audience, if you don't mind. Some of them are complicated, so I might have to think about them for a while. But let me start with one. Any intention to introduce new export control measures to prevent the acquisition of intangibles in semiconductors, things like design or maybe software, by actors like China.
Yeah, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, but that is something we're reviewing on the committee, mindful of the delicate balance that you have with export control, laws.
Yeah.
But I think the overall goal is to make sure that we guard against their ability to use our own system against us, and that they're very good at that. And they are in the 100-year marathon, and they want dominance economically and militarily, and they are moving forward on this. I'd be negligent if I didn't bring up the Development Finance Corporation. Probably one of the best things that the Foreign Affairs Committee has done recently is this is this is the way we compete. Because when I talk to ambassadors from Africa, for instance, they say, we don't really want to do business with the Chinese, but we don't have an alternative. You're not there. So the Development Finance Corporation, by the way, a return on our investment for dollar to dollar to the taxpayer, I want to fully fund it and have the equity fully funded, as well as XM Bank and USAID working together with the private sector to champion U.S. business abroad, but doing it in a way that's good for the host nation. This is going to be the key as to how we can better compete with China. Give me one quick example. Afghanistan. I talked to the ambassador from Afghanistan a lot. Adam Bowler, who's the head of the DFC, we went in. They are sitting on all this rare earth mineral, and it's a gold mine. For whatever reason, during the Iraq-Afghan war, we allowed the Chinese to go in and exploit it. They have asked us now to go in, and they're kicking the Chinese out, and they want us in there. And they also see it. It's a very intriguing story. I'm always highly skeptical of talks with the Taliban, but we got Adam Bowler, the head of DFC, and Special Envoy Khalilzad Zal, sitting down with the Taliban, talking about how there's a carrot approach to a peace deal because they're sitting on an enormous, reserve of rare earth minerals, and that's just one example of many how we can better compete.
One of the questions is actually hits both semiconductors and China. It's, we've put all these constraints on and sanctions on exports to manufacturing equipment and chipsets. What conditions would you need to see from the Chinese that might address our security concerns and let the market reopen? Is there anything the Chinese can do?
Yeah, and it's always been an issue of fair trade with China. I think the president tried to take that on. We'll see how well that trade agreement goes. I think his point was, look, you've been ripping us off for so many years, and the trade deficit is so enormous that it needs to be fair trade. And I always tell, I've got a lot of international business people that come before either the committee or talk to me. And, we do have we are economically intertwined globally. And we do have an interdependence with the Chinese economy. I just think we got to be careful when it comes to items that are scaled on more of the national security level in terms of what we export into that country, because they're very good at copying things. And I always warn businessmen or women that want to go in there that, it may be in your short-term best interest, but look at it from a long-term standpoint and beware, because time and time again, I've heard of, they open up a business and then 5 years later, right down the street is the same manufacturing plant. Yeah. And I don't think, and they just view intellectual property in a different way than we do. And I'm not quite sure. I think they think it's fair game. Whereas we have all these IP laws, they don't. And they don't really make that distinction.
So one of the issues that come up, I want to be respectful of your time, so we have maybe two more questions. And one is, you hear ideas about we need some sort of formal arrangement to work with our allies on technology to build a response to China. We've even had a couple Asian governments, foreign governments come in and suggest some sort of formal agreement, maybe to buttress export controls, maybe to support R&D. Have you thought about the tech alliance idea? Where do you come out on that?
Yeah, I mean, we have our natural allies like NATO, but I think we need to be looking at in the region itself, and that would be Taiwan. That would be South Korea. It would have been Hong Kong, but they've, as you know, the treaty was violated, and that's under PRC control now. But I have Samsung in my district, the largest foreign investment, and that's coming out of South Korea. Taiwan, we have TSMC that we moved to Arizona, and the semiconductor manufacturing capability, which has been phenomenal. That's kind of the pilot program, if you will, of the Chips for America Act that we want to see expanded throughout the various sectors within the United States. So I think we go with our natural partners, but we enlarge it to our allies in the region. One thing we recommend also is taking a look at a trade agreement with Taiwan. Now, I know that could be a little bit controversial, but it would, in a lot of levels, make some sense. And we need to look at normalization of relations with Taiwan. For instance, Taiwan was an observer to the WHO until General Director Tedros kicked them out. They were the first country to warn about the human-to-human transmission, which was utterly disregarded at a very high cost. I think Taiwan should be an observer back in at the WHO. I'm not one of these that say we need to, and we were very careful in the task force also to not say pull out of the WHO. I think you got to be on the field. You can't just take your ball home and otherwise you're not engaged. But I think we need to reform it. They've systematically taken over key positions at the United Nations. For instance, Jim, they were making a run for the intellectual property organization at the United Nations. Can you imagine if the CCP had that position, which is, as they're the largest theft stealer of IP. And so we have to, and I think we're waking up to that. Our allies need to wake up to that. We need to work to get our allies in these positions. And I think we expand our alliance to the region in Asia and work more closely with our Asian partners.
The one I think is the funniest is the Chinese trying to get a seat on the Human Rights Council. That's a real test for the UN. If they do that, holy cow, it'll be hard to defend them anymore. The last question, I'm going to merge two questions because they're both more or less on the same general topic, which is both of the people want to know, there's more to R&D support than fabs. There's more in the semiconductor ecosystem than maybe what the NDAA language has looked at. What are you thinking in terms of expanding support for R&D, or how will support for R&D work? Particularly when you look at a lot of the innovation comes out of the smaller companies. And so where do we find ways to support them? So sort of an R&D flavored question to close out on, which is perfect for Austin.
Yeah, no, look, all this is great for Austin. And I'm doing it, as a representative of a district that has probably more tech companies than any other, or close, pretty much matched by Silicon. So I look at also those an American issue that's vitally important that we maintain a cutting edge in technology. And to your point, the ecosystem is not just the fabrication of advanced semiconductor chips. It goes beyond that to, there are so many artificial intelligence companies here in Austin. And I talked about the Army Futures Command here in Austin. So it's a military ecosystem with the private sector and the university. The quantum computing is so vitally important. There's a race. That's the digital space race, and whoever gets there first is going to control the digital space. The Chinese made an enormous investment in quantum physics and quantum computing, which are these supercomputers that will unravel a lot of mysteries and can de-encrypt everything that's been encrypted. I mean, that they stole the 23 million security clearances from OPM, but they've stolen a lot of big data thefts that we've seen throughout our, in the time we've known each other. And some of this encrypted, but they know that at a point certain, they're going to be able to unravel this stuff and de-encrypt when they master quantum computing. So we need to get, there first. Cybersecurity firms all throughout, the country, and particularly here in Austin, is also part of that ecosystem. And then finally, the telecom, the 5G, we got the Department of Defense to open up that DoD spectrum so that we could be more competitive. And now they're going to auction off the spectrum with kind of a lease back situation where if in a time of emergency, they can get the spectrum back. But in the meantime, let's use it to our advantage so that we can compete with China in 5G. I would submit that we are in a close competition that some would argue we're not winning. And that's one that we really need to prevail on as well. So you're right. All those different facets of technology are all part of the ecosystem that play into this. And I think, the capital investment from the federal level, but I think getting back to the tax code, the R&D tax credit and the refundable investment tax credit is really the way to really set a spark plug to it.
Well, that was a great answer. Being able to drag the tax code back in. I never thought I'd be asking about tax code in my life, but here it is.
I never thought I would be in the middle of it either, but here we are. And
yeah,
as mundane as it can be, it actually is pretty vital to incentivizing.
It's a different kind of war when one of your principal tools is the tax code. Hey, we've taken up, go ahead.
Kevin's already joked about there's some action hero ad that I think Dan Crenshaw, where he's jumping out of an airplane. Kevin's like, I thought I could jump out of an airplane, with the tax code in my hand, This sort of Mission Impossible video. But
yeah. So we've taken up as much time as we promised we told you to. I know you're busy. Do you have any final thoughts or advice you'd want to give us? I think that what I take away from this is bipartisan consensus on the need to confront China, a willingness to spend, a focus on semiconductors, and correct me if I'm wrong, not just on fabs, but on R&D and the intangible side of it, maybe down the road. And of course, the optimism about winning the tax credit battle. But what have I missed? What would you want to add?
No, I think you covered it very well. This is my 8th term, hopefully going on 9. And the one thing I've learned the most is that you really can't be effective or get anything done unless you're willing to work across the aisle, And that's one of the first things when we were presented with this by the semiconductor industry. One of the first calls I made was strategy thinking was who can we reach out across the aisle to get them on board, knowing that, Silicon's going to be a big player here, and knowing that the speaker's from that state. And so is Kevin McCarthy. And so I always think it's a very good strategy, and I really like CSIS's thinking on this and your support over the years with your products. And I've enjoyed working with you on products as well. Very helpful to the policymaker on the Hill. And then you have to get into the politics of how can I get this thing done? And then it becomes relationship driven. And then you hope the best ideas prevail on both sides of the aisle like this one. And you can actually get it enacted into law and look back on it as a really extraordinary accomplishment for the country. So that's sort of where I am.
It is an extraordinary accomplishment. It's one I think none of us would have expected a few years ago, but we'll leave the politics to you. That's your job.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks, Jim. Always a pleasure. And thanks for what you do.
Yeah, talk to you soon. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Bye.